I'm going to give a quick presentation about the basics of Varroa, and then we will switch to our panel. Our panel tonight is Alla, Konrad, Oliver, and we also added Robert last minute because Oliver mentioned that Robert does oxalic vapor treatments. Before we switch to the panelists and do introductions, I'm going to just quickly show a few slides so that anybody who is really new to the subject of Varroa has at least some base understanding to build upon. So let me present just a second. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen. We're going to go into present mode. Cool. So very quickly, I'm just going to flip through some slides. So Varroa Destructor is the mite that we're going to be talking about today. This is a parasitic invasive mite. So it's not native to the United States. Neither is Apis mellifera, the Western honeybee, but these mites are actually from a different continent, and we'll talk a bit about that. They feed on the fat body tissue of larva, pupa, and adult bees, and it weakens the bees. So this is really dangerous for the hives. It reduces colony vigor. They transmit disease and enhance diseases because they weaken the bees' ability to fight off diseases that may be present in the hive otherwise. And colonies with high levels of Varroa are likely to die. So it's probably one of the most dangerous things for your hives, and that's why we're talking about it today. And also the next meeting, we will also be talking about Varroa, but with an expert on their biology. So that two Varroa sessions in a row. All right. Varroa is now almost everywhere. The only continent where it's not is Australia, well, and Antarctica, but that doesn't do us very much good. So, you know, it is spread almost everywhere. They came from Korea, Japan, Thailand, and co-evolved with Apis cerana, which is the Asian honeybee. So the Asian honeybee has some natural defenses against them that the Western honeybee doesn't. And they got a foothold in the US starting in 1987. I was going to ask Oliver, do you remember when they arrived in California? Was it in the 80s or was it later?
Mid-90s they got us.
90s, okay. So the life cycle of the Varroa, I'm not going to go into detail because we'll probably go into this next meeting when we have our expert. But I wanted to say that mites mostly reproduce in capped cells. And as we talk about treatments today, some treatments will have a vapor that will penetrate the cell cappings and can kill mites within the cells. Some do not. So it's just something to be aware of as we talk about different types of treatment. And something else to keep in mind, mite load tends to double every month. So, you know, this isn't something that grows linearly, it grows exponentially. So you need to pay attention to your mite loads. It might look pretty low one month and then it'll be double the next month, which can be a huge difference for the health of your bees. This is a graph showing the differences in population peaks between mites and bees. The blue line is the bee population. The peak is going to be right around the middle of summer. And you can see that the mite population kind of lags that. So actually, we're kind of reaching peak mite population time between now and September. So this can be a pretty important time to check and see what your mite load looks like. And we'll talk a bit about different ways of doing that today too. You may be thinking that you're special and your hives don't have Varroa. That may be the case today. It's unlikely, but it is possible. However, this isn't a static thing. One of the things that I don't think a lot of beginner beekeepers realize is that your bee population is not a static thing. Bees from other colonies will drift into your colony. So sometimes you'll get workers that will come in and like take up residence. They'll become part of your hive. Sometimes you'll get bees that come in to steal honey and they will carry mites with them in that way. Sometimes mites will be exchanged on flowers as bees are gathering nectar and pollen. So there are lots of ways in which the your mites will be introduced to your hive. So don't think that you can get away from this, unfortunately. This is something that everybody who keeps bees in the United States needs to pay attention to. Another thing to keep in mind is we often talk about like freezing frames. That's not to prevent mite spread. It's to prevent the spread of beetles and moths that can damage the frames, which are secondary colonists to your hive, or secondary pests. So you don't necessarily have to worry about Varroa when it comes to frame preservation. And then just one other thing that may come up tonight so that everybody has kind of a primer. IPM, or integrated pest management, is this idea that we need to employ a bunch of different integrated solutions to manage mites. So some of the terms that you may hear include kind of cultural mechanical ways of dealing with mites, like brood breaks, or using frames of drone brood, freezing those, and then killing. Mites are particularly attracted to drones or drone cells. So that's another way of physically managing the mite load. You may hear talk of powdered sugar being used to sprinkle over the hive. That's also a method of testing for your mite load. And then we'll also talk about chemical treatments to some extent. So there are two kind of classes of chemical treatments. Here they say synthetic and natural. You might also hear synthetics and organic acids. So none of these are really natural to your hive in that they would exist in the concentrations that they do when you treat. But you may hear that distinction made as well between synthetic and organic acids or natural compounds. I sent out an email. I don't know if Elizabeth had a chance to forward it on right before the meeting, but everybody should take a look at this document from the Honeybee Health Coalition. It'll give you a great overview, way better than I can give in just a few minutes, about what Varroa are, how to test for them, different methods for treating for them, what kinds of treatments you might use at different types of the year or times of the year, and different considerations you might want to use when making those choices. So, all right, that's enough of me talking. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we are going to introduce our panelists. So let's start with Alla. Alla, would you tell us a little bit about how long you've been keeping bees?
It's this year 10 years. And first year I was treating, second year I started to read about natural beekeeping, and in San Mateo, they organized a small group in a guild who decided to do natural management. So I joined this group and I started to read a lot, and because I'm from Ukraine and spoke Ukrainian and Russian, I talk a lot and Skype a lot with beekeepers there in Europe, and so I kind of develop my way of doing beekeeping, natural way, and yeah, 8 years I'm doing only natural management. Don't treat, don't do any chemicals at all.
Great, thanks, Alla. Oliver, would you tell us how long you've been keeping bees?
This is my 50th year.
I think you're muted.
Whoa.
He's not. We hear him.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Whoever's
in the
my
background.
face for a minute.
Hi. You may not recognize Oliver from the meetings. He usually hangs out toward the back and is also active on the email list. Robert, how long have you been keeping bees? You said 10 years, I think? You're muted right now.
I'm new to Zoom. I've been keeping bees now. This is my 6th year. And I have a very nice and intelligent mentor who's taught me everything I know. His name's Oliver. So I happen to be a medical doctor as well. And so I look at sick things as needing to get as much help as they can towards recovery. And so I treat bees for various things, but for Varroa, I've used various different methods. You have your IPM pyramid. I have screen bottom boards. I have culled drones, and all the way up the ladder, except for the hard chemicals. Currently, I'm using Mite-Away, I used to use Mite-Away quick strips. I've switched to Formic Pro. In fact, I did 11 hives today with Formic Pro. But before the Formic Pro, when I only had a couple hives, I was doing oxalic acid vaporization. And just one caveat about that is it's not legal in California right now.
Right. Yeah. So there are oxalic acid treatment methods that are legal currently in California. Others that are legal in Europe. So just be aware. That doesn't mean that members of the guild do not use some of these methods that are legal in Europe and not here. But it is something to be aware of, especially if you're talking to, for example, the county. And lastly, Konrad, how long have you been keeping bees and what kind of treatment methods do you use?
Konrad Thaler. I've had bees since 2015, so 5 years. One of my personality traits is that I cannot do small. So I have currently about 180 hives. I do not treat with synthetic treatments. And just like Robert, I'm doing everything from cutting out drone brood to formic acid, oxalic acid, dribble. I'm a great follower and fan of Randy Oliver, so this year I will experiment with some sponges and soaking them in in oxalic acid. And what's the oil again? My God, I can't remember that.
Glycerin. Vegetable glycerin.
Glycerin, yeah. So for me, it's important to shake up and mix up as much treatments as I can. Because I have mostly my bees out on the coast, I have already harvested or taken off all the supers, so there's no more honey production. I'm just keeping them, getting them ready for the winter. I also bring my bees to the almonds for pollination. Yeah, honey production is not my issue, or not my intention of beekeeping. And with the treatments, I hope this comes up clearly that everything but oxalic acid, sorry, formic acid, may contaminate your honey. So I hope that this becomes clear to especially starting beekeepers that you shouldn't really have a super on all year and treat all year. Okay, that's it for now.
I have a question. You said everything but which acid can contaminate the honey?
Formic. So so most treatments you don't do when honey supers are on. And if you treat with the other types of treatments, you should also probably mark your brood box frames so you know that they have been treated if you ever harvest them. You have to be more careful about this if you're selling the honey in particular, and if you're using synthetic treatments, which can be even more dangerous. Oliver, we skipped over you to talk a little bit about the treatment methods that you've used, which probably run the gamut at this point, but just curious, like, how are you dealing with treating your hives now?
I've tried many over the years, and last few years I've been using Apivar.
Cool. So, so we kind of have a range here. Oliver uses all the treatment methods up through synthetic chemicals. Konrad uses and Robert both use. Do you prefer Robert or Bob?
Bob is fine.
Bob. Okay. So so Bob and Konrad both use organic acids. So kind of the softer chemical treatments, and Alla does not use any chemical treatments whatsoever. So you know, we've got a range of different treatment methods. I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about testing as well before we kind of open it up to the floor for questions. So if you could each kind of in turn, and why don't we start backwards this time? So Konrad, would you tell us a little bit about whether or not you test for mite load in your hives, and if so, how you do it and how frequently?
I do not test. It's too intensive for time-wise. And I made some calculations. If I would do the one that what I believe would be an alcohol wash, but an alcohol wash would be about 300 bees per hive times 180 hives. That's about 60,000 bees, and that's 3 or 4 or 5 hives that I would kill just by doing it for once. And it's a lot of work. So I do not treat. I look for deformed wing virus. If I see that, a big red flag goes up. And I have started about a month ago already with mite away quick strips. A, they are okay for supers, and B, I want to be as early and proactive as possible. And you showed that curve. So right now the bees are already going down. Then the number of bees, they're starting to make winter bees soon. And the mite load is still going up. So I'm like to nip that in the bud as soon as possible. And I do not do any testing. Bob.
Thanks. Bob, how about you?
Yeah, my testing is a lot like Konrad's. I look on the ground and see crawlers with no wings. That means I have to do something. That is a clear sign that there are a lot of Varroa mites in the hives. And so I can't tell which hive I have 6 hives in my backyard. I have another apiary with 4 and etc. So I've got 9 different places I have to go to. And as he says, it takes a long time to test. Having said that, you know, the Honeybee Health Coalition and BIP all say you should be testing your hives every month and following your mite counts. Randy Oliver just came out with a new Excel spreadsheet that will make your head spin to help you figure out how many mites you have. And part of that is to do your alcohol washes or sugar shakes and input the numbers of mites, and it will tell you when you need to make treatments and so forth. I haven't done that either. What I've done is I've treated basically around this time of year to make sure that the bees that are going to be overwintering bees are going to have their lifespan as what a healthy bee lifespan should be, because we know that mites eat the fat bodies, that stunts the growth of the bees and not only stunts it, but shortens their life. So I treat them, like I said, I just treated 10 hives today or 11, and I've got, 16 more to go tomorrow and the next day. But again, I did do a sugar roll today, just because I had to do it for a program I'm in as a practical exam. So I videotaped it, and I had more mites than I should have had. There were 10 mites at least. So in that hive, that's over 3 per 100 bees. And like you say, they're going to expand this is the peak of the bee population, and the mites are going to continue to rise when the bee population starts to sink. So this, to me, is the right time to treat those hives. So deformed wing virus, trying to understand the biology of the bees. Other people say that's no good. You really need to follow the hives. And that's probably a better way to do it, but it's very time consuming. So I don't do it.
Thanks.
I don't test. I don't measure the mite loads as a regular thing.
I just want to mention before we move on to Oliver, if you're leaving messages in chat, this is one of the things that I do not like about Zoom. The default is to message just the panelists, so the other attendees can't see your message. That's okay. I will read out your questions later, but if you remember to switch the drop down to all panelists and attendees so that everybody else can see your questions as well. All right, let's switch to Oliver. Oliver, have you done any, I'm guessing with the number of hives that you keep that you also do not do regular either alcohol washes or sugar rolls?
No, all of the treatments recommend that you treat all of the hives in the apiary at the same time. So, and the mites have been such a big problem for so long, and almost all professionals say that everybody has mites in all their hives. So it hasn't been important to me to determine the exact quantity that I have. I just know we have them. The whole treatment regime is very time consuming, and because of our honey flows around here, you're limited very small windows to when you can do it. So rather than testing, I just treat every hive and every apiary when we harvest, because that's about the only time you can have a hive without honey supers on it, because we, in certain apiaries, we use to put our wet supers back on, so we don't want the treatment on there when we have wet honey supers on. And then we have those winter flows, so some strong hives, I keep a super on during the winter, and then the main flow starts so early. I mean, even January, February, March, you have to have supers on at certain sites. So the window of treatment is so small that I just treat everything after harvest.
And before we switch to Alla, I want to mention that all of the beekeepers we're speaking with today about treatment and testing are experienced beekeepers. So don't be discouraged if you are interested in testing for mite load. I probably should have anticipated this before we talked. But yeah, I think for new beekeepers, it can be really beneficial, especially if you only have 1 or 2 hives, to test for the mite load. You may have also heard Konrad talk about alcohol washes, which will kill the bees. There is another method called sugar rolls. I'm happy to send out a deck that goes through how those work. If you're interested, it's also in the document that we emailed out earlier. Alla, how about you? Do you do any testing, either sugar rolls, alcohol washes, counting mites on the bottom boards?
So my testing is during the, from the spring to the end of the drone population. I use a uncapping fork and I pull out drones from the drone frames and turn it over and look how many mites I have. This fork usually pull out like 10, 15 drones, and I can see 1 or 2 or 3 mites. So if it's 1, 2, or 3, it's okay. If I see more, I kind of already question what's wrong with this hive, what should I do, how I should approach this problem. So, and because I also have from 50 to 70 hives, and it's very difficult to do any testing like alcohol, and I really hate to see dead bees, you know, after alcohol. Sugar tasting I did first year of my beekeeping, and my bees were recovering like 3 days. It was so stressful for them. They were cleaning. They did clean a lot of mites, but after 1 month, all this amount of mites was covered and even more. So I just realized it's absolutely not working for me. But as a first year beekeeper, I think it's very important for people to understand. Yeah, one more thing I want to mention. At the first year, I did counted mites through the screen bottom board on a board. And it started like August. Randy Oliver said like August 15, it's a dead due date. You have to go and test it and for sure treat it. And I counted it, it was like 15 mites I had. And I said, oh, I'm great, my hive going to survive. 1 week later, I calculated it was 100. 3 days later, I calculated it was 200, and it was going like, number was like up to 700 in a month. So I was like devastated. I said, my God, what should I do?
Oh,
So
that was 700 mites per 100 bees, or that was 700 mites in the
no,
hive?
in a bottom board.
Oh, wow.
Not
Okay.
per bees, in a whole hive. So in a bottom board, you know, like it was just covered, it was rug. So I treated it with mite away and hive died. My queen died and hive eventually died. So second hive I did not treat and it survived, you know, with a little bit less than 700, probably 500 mites, but it survived. And I just realized that you treat it or you don't treat it, it's not a point. The point is start your beekeeping from the right corner. So, and I started I just gave them, my bees, kind of like opportunity to survive by themselves, doing what they supposed to do. So I stopped using plastic foundation, throw away all frames I purchased. I still used wax foundation, but friend of mine did a test and she said, it's so much chemicals there. You planning to do comb honey, don't do this. So next year I switched completely, remove everything and did only small strip of the comb wax, which I was buying at Man Lake. And from now on, all my bees on a natural wax. They do whatever they want, how they want, big cells, small cells, medium cells, you know, whenever they need. Only what I manage, it's, I'm giving them fresh frames in the middle, and all old comb I just push on side and take it out. So I noticed that mites much better like old combs and fresh one. And
Let's
I
talk
do a
about
lot
that.
of other treatments, but it's probably gonna be next question. I mean,
Yeah.
treatments like I use herbs, you know, like I use artemisia and pine. Do some kind of like a compote, like kind of liquid with a little bit sugar, and I give it to bees, and they eat it and they put it a little bit in frames. This like healing honey I called, it's not crystallized. You can see it on a frame very easy. So you won't be able to extract it. You won't be able to mix it with something else. And usually in a spring, I take it out, put it in a freezer. And if I see kind of like a sick hive going a little bit not as good as I want, I just give them frame, and it's amazingly overnight bees change their behavior, you know, after this herbs treatment. So
let me ask a couple of follow-up questions about that. The first thing I want to mention, Alla was talking about, is foundationless frames. So there is a belief among some beekeepers, I'm sure there's research on this too, around the use of foundation that forces the bees to create comb of a certain size. Also, Alla mentioned that the backing to those frames, at least her first year, were plastic, and that plastic can absorb certain chemicals that are usually fat soluble. So some beekeepers choose not to use foundation on their frames, even wax foundation, because it makes the bees create comb of a certain size when they might want to create comb of a different size. And I was wondering, Alla, if you could talk a little bit about why that matters, why it matters that the bees are allowed to create cells the size that they want.
It's very important because we have so many type of bees in Bay Area. You buy bees every year and you don't know where they come from, what kind of bees it is, you know, and all of them are different sizes. They need different sizes of cells because if it's big bees, I have some hives, the drones, like double size of all other drones. So they need their own cells, you know, to develop right. The same for bees. And right now is a time when bees, queen laying eggs, and this bee is gonna be winter bees. They will be 1.5 times bigger than all previous bees. The reason why, first of all, they kind of feed them a little bit different. It's a winter bee. Second, this bee is not gonna be involved in feeding and raising next population. It's going to be kind of like a winter bees who supposed to, by the biology of the bee, going to the cluster and overwinter for 4-6 months in some area. We have the weather and climate when bees can't have this privilege to rest. So they will work basically all winter. Maybe they will cluster 1 month altogether, but most of the time they're still foraging, flying out basically every day, at least for hour or couple hours. And we have brood non-stop in a hive. It's gonna be like really small cluster. It could be 1 frame, 2 frames. Some hives have 3 and 4, but it's gonna be very small amount of bees. So right now it's very important. Bees should raise winter bee. And for this purpose, I'm giving them in the middle fresh comb, not white, they're not drawing white, but comb which was used maybe 1 or 2 times, you know, and in purpose I collected and separated, and right now I'm started to giving them in the middle and put on a side all old frames. And in this case, every time when I check, right now there is no drones anymore, but still brood. And if I will take this fork and capping fork and pull it out, I can check my brood if it has mites. And I checked already 25 hives. I have, in some I have 1 mites, in some I have 0. Yeah, it's of course it's like a, obviously they have mites. I would not, you know, but when I tested it, I did not see it. And to me, you just feel like, oh, my bees really did good.
So one of the things that Alla mentioned is that bees in our area are going to have brood throughout the winter. So to some extent, the queen is laying throughout the winter. The reason that's important is because, as we talked about before, mites they repopulate, or they reproduce. That's the word I was looking for. Within the comb, within the brood comb. So in areas where it gets cold enough for the hive to for the queen to completely stop laying for some period of time, it's what's called a brood break. And a brood break is one of the mechanical or cultural methods of controlling the Varroa population, because it provides a break where the Varroa can't reproduce. So I think I just wanted to mention why that was relevant. And I wonder, Alla, we will come back to you in a bit, but I was wondering if we could talk a little bit with Bob, because Bob, it sounds like you've used a couple of the different methods for oxalic acid treatment, and I wanted to make sure that we get a chance to go through those. I know that Konrad has as well. So everyone's aware that there are basically 3 methods of oxalic acid treatment. One is a drip, which is legal in the US. Another is was popularized by Randy Oliver, which is soaking either sponges or shop towels in a combination of vegetable glycerin and oxalic acid, and laying those over the hives as you would like a max strip, like a formic acid strip. And then the last is oxalic acid vaporization. And I was wondering, Bob, why did you choose to stop doing the oxalic acid vapor? I know that it was, you know, a lot of members are pretty impressed with that treatment. So I was just curious why you've switched.
Okay, so I never did dribble, and I haven't done shop towels. I've only done the vaporization. And so I should talk about that a little bit, right? As you mentioned earlier, certain acids will penetrate wax and be able to treat the mites under the capping, and others don't. And oxalic acid does not penetrate the wax. So all the mites that are under cappings are not treated by an oxalic acid treatment of any type. When you use oxalic acid, you are treating only the phoretic mites. Phoretic means they're not under the cappings, they're out in the hive somewhere. So phoretic mites are the only mites you can treat. That's why the oxalic acid treatments are recommended during a time when you don't have any brood. So let's say I catch a swarm. I will treat that with 1 dose of oxalic acid to kill all the mites, because a swarm does not have even comb at that point. Or I will put that swarm into a box and let them settle in for about a week, because we know that it's on the 8th day that capping occurs after the egg is laid. So the new swarm comes in and the queen says, this is drawn comb, I'm going to start laying eggs. That won't be capped until the 8th day. So I will give them 1 shot of oxalic acid, which is thought to kill 92% more or less of the phoretic mites. The dribble and the shop towels, I don't know about the shop towels, but there are plenty of articles. I have one available that shows that the sublimation or vaporization has the highest kill rate of the oxalic acid methods. Okay, so if I'm going to treat a hive and it has brood, including drones in particular, because drones are under the cappings for 13 days, I feel like I have to cover with oxalic that entire time frame. Otherwise, I'm not going to get all the mites. Okay, so an egg, let's say a cell is capped on today, and I treat with oxalic acid today. Well, that mite is protected until 12 days from now, when it emerges as an adult with the adult bee. So every day, the drones that are already there, I mean, this is true for workers as well, but the drones are the key because they have the longest time under the cappings. So if I want, and the other thing is that when mites come out of a cell, a drone cell, they ride around outside of the cell on an average of 5 to 7 days before they find another cell where there's a larva at the 6th instar stage, and they gets chemicals messages that's going to be capped tomorrow or within the next few hours. And the mite uses that against the larva and will jump in there before they cap it over. Anyway, long story short, I have, with their riding around 5 days, I have 5 days to kill that mite. So I will treat on day 1, day 5, day 10, day 15. That means every mite that's come out during that time frame is going to have a chance for me to kill it. So that's very labor intensive, right? And that's really why I stopped. When I had 2 hives in my backyard or 3 hives or even 4 hives, that's fine. But I can't do it with 26 hives. It's just not because you have to do it when the bees are there. So it's either early morning or late at night, as far as I'm concerned. You can treat them during the day, but all the foragers are out and they're carrying mites as well. So that's my thought process on that. So I've switched to Formic Pro, which you can put 2 strips in. It will penetrate the wax and it will kill for, if you use 2 strips, it's a single treatment of 14 days. During that whole time, the formic acid or the formic acid is penetrating the cells and killing the mites. Or you can do a 10-day, one strip for 10 days, and take it out and put a new strip in for another 10 days. And I've just read an article recently where there really isn't a significant difference in terms of the mite kill. It was 89% with the 2-strip treatment, and it was 81%, which they said was not statistically significant in terms of the actual percentage of kill. That also is a matter of time involvement. So, you know, if you had, how many does Konrad have? 100 and something hives, and you decide to do 1 strip and 1 strip, that means you're doubling up the amount of work that you have to do.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. So we talked a bit about how the number of hives that you have really influences whether or not you test for Varroa or just treat. And then the other is that your methods of treatment really, some are more labor intensive than others. So you know, that probably also is a factor in the types of treatment that different people choose to use. So if you're a hobbyist beekeeper, some of the methods used by somebody keeping 150 hives are not necessarily going to make sense for you just keeping 1 or 2 hives in your backyard. I was wondering on the subject of Formic, since Bob, you've used both Formic Pro and Max, I think you said. I know there's a difference, but I forget what it is and why you would choose one over the other.
The difference is in the formulation of the strip, the non-formic portion, and how it releases the formic. It's also the Max, MAQS, it's messy. There's a kind of a liquid, it's kind of gooey on the surface of the strip, whereas the Formic Pros are easy to handle. It's a cardboard. There's no, both of them come in a 2-pack. It could be, so you can treat 1 hive or 2 hives at a time. But that's the difference, is the handling properties of the strips.
And while we're on the subject of Formic, one of the questions that's come through in chat is around, Newt asks, Max seemed to make the bees very grumpy during treatment, perhaps an issue for urban locations. For those who use Max, do you observe grumpy bees? I have used Max, and I was using ones that were close to expiration, and my bees bearded because they were effectively being fumigated. The queen did survive, which, by the way, is another factor in choosing some of these treatments, is some of them put quite a lot of stress on queens, and some people report that, in particular, formic acid can kill queens. Mine happened to survive, and I think I got lucky, but I have also observed general grumpiness with Max. I don't know, how about you, Bob? What do you think?
Actually, I've found just the opposite. I find that it's like they got a new lease on life or something. They just start flying. It's really noticeable that a hive that hasn't been doing much, all of a sudden the bees are all like, yeah, let's go. And doxalic vapor is the same way. It's like they don't have this ball and chain around their ankles anymore.
One other thing before we move on, Konrad, I wanted to ask you about your experience with Formic as well. But Bob, before we do that, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the kind of PPE that you need in order to do an oxalic vapor treatment. I remember seeing a discussion thread at some point that it can be really dangerous to breathe that in. So I was just curious if you could talk a bit about what it takes. I think he's going to go and grab his respirator.
It's a good
Yeah, but
There it is. Yeah.
3M makes this is a 3M mask.
Yeah.
And these are cartridges that are specific for organic acids. So they clip right on. They're not very expensive. Well, maybe they are now. People were buying these. It was like $6 when I bought this back in the day.
Are you
Now they're
buying for bees as
$25.
well?
What's that?
Are you buying the same things for every bees?
The same
So-
thing.
So Alla is suggesting that the bees are breathing in something that humans wouldn't want to breathe in. So Alla.
Absolutely they are. But you know what? There are studies out that say it doesn't bother them. You know, I know Alla has her point of view, but you know, what's worse, having to breathe in a little acid that doesn't kill them, or having the whole colony die because of mites? I don't know. That's kind of how I see it.
So one of the things that beekeepers are most passionate about, I think, is this subject, which is whether or not to treat with chemicals for Varroa. So you'll hear some of that probably come out with some of our questions and presenters today. Konrad, could you talk a little bit about whether or not, answering the same question we were talking about before, whether or not you see a difference in temperament with your bees when you treat with formic?
No, I do not see it. I just treated it again. I said about 4 weeks ago. I am putting one strip in, and it's fairly quick. I just crack the back of the box, slip it in. It's already ready and prepared on the top, and then I move on to the next one. So, and I only do one thing, so I'm not going to take the whole hive apart. And I agree, or I hear a sound, zzz, but it's not really an issue. Bees being grumpy, and it has been a long discussion here over the last 3, 4, 5 months about grumpy bees. It's often if they are queenless, if they're drone layers, if they're genetically different, a lot more than if I treat. I do have a couple other things that I want to just run by. Just right now, twice a year, I use from Manlake a probiotic powder that I put in. I do believe not just in putting organic acids in it, but I also believe in the fact that the bees need to stay healthy. And that's, I actually just today I treated about 60 hives with probiotics. Then I like Alla's idea, and I've seen it before several times. Having a fork and an uncapping fork, and just pull out 10, 15, 20 drones is a really great idea. Something that I often do is when I crack the box between the first and the second box, there's lots of drone brood in it, and I can see at that moment I break the whole brood there, and I can see if there is Varroa mites in it. So that's a very quick fix for me to see, okay, yes or no. Then I also want to emphasize or confirm with Bob. There's sort of 2 times and 2 kinds of hives that I'm treating, and one is the nukes in the spring. It's a great opportunity to treat either a nuke or a swarm, and I do sell nukes. So at a specific time, just before the caps are on, I treat that nuke with oxalic acid and I dribble, and that helps tremendously. Just a quick, what's the word? Correction to Bob. The egg is in for 3 days, then the larvae is in for 9 days. So the capping happens on the 12th day. and then on the 21st day, the pupae emerges. For what
Well, the point is that the capping on the drone is 12 and a half, 13 days.
correct. The drone is
Not
even
when the egg is, the whole egg larva period has nothing, is only the time when the,
correct.
the oxalic is going to work. The point of the oxalic and it's under the capping time, not
Right, but if you catch a swarm today, you have 12 days at least until the first capping would mathematically happen.
Oh, I see that point. Very good.
So
Okay.
I think what you just heard is a difference in counting, whether or not you're counting from the first larval day or the first egg day.
Correct.
So just, just a little bit of.
And Elizabeth's chart is fantastic. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And it's also different. It's also different for workers and drones.
Correct. But I assume like a swarm or a nuke, the queen is not starting to lay drone eggs, so she's laying worker eggs.
And she's probably not laying the first day she shows up.
That is correct. So we have that's why I say at least 12 days. So, and then another thought that I have is it's good to have a variation of treatments and not use the same one for the sake of resistancy. So that's what I'm doing. This in the next probably months or two, I will actually start, which I've never done, the oxalic glycerin pads. And what Bob was saying about the fact that we have to treat with oxalic acid multiple times in order to reach all of the mites that are capped in. One of Randy Oliver's ideas with a shop towel and now with a sponge is that it's a slow release, meaning it takes them 2, 3, 4 weeks to break down the shop towel, and as they crawl over, as they drag the shop towel through the hive, mites that have emerged are still getting killed. And so that's an easy and lazy way for some beekeepers that have a lot of bees like me to just put a shop towel in and then wait a month, and eventually a lot of mites have died. Versus with a drip, there's a one-time application, but it doesn't kill.
Vapor.
Yeah.
We haven't heard too much from Oliver, so and we'll return back to Alla, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions. Oliver, I was wondering if we talk a little bit about why you choose to use Apivar and whether or not you'd recommend that for hobbyist beekeepers, people who have fewer than 10 hives, or if that's just something that you kind of use for reasons of the scale of beekeeping that you're doing.
You said earlier that I mentioned that I've used most of the treatments, and something you said indicated that I use all of them. I certainly don't use all of them all the time. I've had more years since the mite came 25 years ago. I've had more years that were treatment free than treatment. But the change in my beekeeping came when I started adding clients for whom I keep bees. And when you have a client who's worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars and all of their bees die in the winter, or half of their bees die in the winter, you don't look very good as a professional beekeeper. And most of those people are not real concerned about being organic and treatment free. They mostly want to get a bang for their buck of what they're paying their beekeeper. So I went to Apivar because it's like Apistan. Apistan is a plastic strip, and it's the same as check mite. They're plastic strips you drop in. They're quick, clean. With the Apivar, you come back in 6 weeks and take them out and throw them away. And the Apivar, the chemical in the Apivar, both the manufacturer and studies done says the chemical as a whole disappears very rapidly. And when I first did it, I wanted to send some of my honey to a lab to have tested for Apivar content. And the lab said, we cannot test for Apivar because it all breaks down so fast that the combined effect is not there anymore for us to find. All we can find is some of the components of Apivar, and I'm treating over 100 hives in about 30 apiaries, and I'm handicapped, and I pay employees to do that all for me. So I need something that can be done quickly and cleanly. And I've tried the Hop Guard and the MAQS, and those are nauseous fumes, and I don't like breathing nauseous fumes, so I've only used those once.
Is expense also one of the factors? Because I don't know how much Apivar costs, but the Formic strips can be quite expensive.
The Apivar strips bought in the larger bags are about $250 or $275 a strip.
Okay.
And you put 1 on 5 frames of bees, and the bees are so affected by mites and other problems in this era that many colonies we go to when we treat have reduced already to only about 5 frames of bees, or they're new colonies we started. So most colonies only take 1 strip. On some of them we put in 2, so it costs you about $5. Much more being expensive for me is being the return trip back to the hives to remove it after 6 weeks.
Got it. So yeah, so Oliver's talking about these are all considerations, right? For a professional beekeeper, and labor is one of the most expensive costs, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and then another thing I always consider, we live in a horrendously polluted world. I was at a Chinese restaurant once where ants were crawling up the wall, and we pointed it out to the waiter, and he immediately ran over with a can of Raid and started spraying down the whole wall with Raid while we were eating dinner. And that's the kind of world we live in. And I have a guy who buys honey from me who's terrified of chemtrails. And chemtrails, of course, the conspiracy theorists think is chemicals being applied to us through jet exhaust. And as I drive around day to day, I pass every day half a dozen pest control companies. So yes, I'm very concerned about putting chemicals in my hive, but I feel if I follow the directions so that it's not on when the honey supers are on, there's no more pollutants involved than we're all in contact with every day in our daily life, because the world is so polluted with toxic chemicals already, not only our beehives.
Thanks, Oliver. Alla, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the IPM methods that you use. Do you do any kind of mite traps or drone traps?
So my method is I split during the year minimum 2 times.
So that's important because it's a brood break, right?
Yes, it creates a broodless period, and this is why my mites level is very low.
And so, sorry, just a follow-up question there. So if you're splitting 2 times a year, that means that you are taking 1 hive and making it into 4.
Hive,
okay.
1 hive I split, it's 1 nuke. And after this hive, I split 1 more time, it's 2 nukes. So
okay.
it gets,
you add 2 hives on. Okay, got it.
Second split, I usually, in a while, I bring it back because it just, like I need to create broodless period. And when you create broodless period, bees brings much more honey. So they not involved in a raising brood, they only foraging. And this is my goal, like I collect much more honey. And when I bring, and second goal is just, I don't treat and I don't waste my time on this. And plus my bees kind of like get happier. So second nuke, which I make, I usually bring it back, and I keep most of my hives double queen. And bees at winter time, I mean, not at winter, like they they make a choice in a fall, late fall. They just choose which queen they like better, and they abandon one queen and they go with another one. So, and for me, instead of me choosing which one is better, they know better which one. So it's a second 2 splits. And in August, right now, I am doing queen isolation. I have a special queen cages, big one, like 10, 12 inches long and 1.5 inch tall. And I cut one of the frames and I put this cage inside. So queen is really happy resting, not laying. And bees smell her and as well happy, and again collect much more honey in last moment, you know, to get whatever they can. And
That's really interesting. So you're creating broodless periods, not just by doing splits, but also by kind of sequestering the queen still in the hive.
yeah.
So you don't get, so you have a broodless period, but at the same time, you don't have to worry about necessarily like moving out a nuke and then doing a recombine, which can be, you know, a
Yeah.
lot of labor moving the frames back and forth.
Yeah, labor, equipment, space, you know, I don't need all these things. I just make this last kind of like a isolation of the queen just for resting. Queen is resting, ready for winter bees, and bees are resting, you know, foraging and not involved in too much brood raising. So because bees really does not need huge amount of bees, they need one box. Actually, I leave usually 7 frames brood box, and this is it, how my bees overwinter. And they, last year I did not have one hive died from mites. So like
Wow.
it was very successful winter, but I do have some losses, but it's not big. Like I would say on 50, 70 hives, it's very, every year I send, I need to reduce amount of bees. I need to reduce, and it never happens. I always end up with more, more hives than I started. So usually I had like 5, maximum loss I had one year, it was like 8. So I think it's a really good percentage.
Wow. Yeah, that one of the questions that came up in chat was what people's loss percentages are. I think one caveat to that question is that, like, remember that these beekeepers are self-reporting their numbers. And another is that there are different stressors on the bees depending upon, you know, what kinds of, why those bees exist. Alla, so do you, what is your primary reason for keeping bees? Are you selling off nukes? Are you, is it for the honey? Is it for pollination? You know, do you move your bees around for pollination services, that kind of thing?
No, I don't move my bees for pollination. I still did not figure out what is my goal is. When I started, I thought I just want to try honey, and I fall in love with taste and everything and with bees. And after I just decided, well, let me be Mother Teresa and save bees. And I wanted to try one method, you know, which nobody tries. It's not treat and not put any chemicals and let bees have a really, how to say, their own life, you know, like not be involved very much, especially with chemicals in their biological. And yeah, and by the way, the less I treat, then more my bees became better and better. I have almost 80% hygienic bees. They pull out the larvae and throw it away, and they kind of like test themselves, you know. And hive which supposed to die, they probably will die anyway if I treat it or I not treat it. So I decided I better not to treat.
I think one of the really complicated things about beekeeping is that you're working with a very complicated system, right? Like
Exactly.
bees are, so it's often difficult to tell whether or not your actions have the intended effect or not. So I think that's just one of the, it's one of the things that we can appreciate about bees is that, you know, that they are complicated and we're doing our best just to understand them. And you know, it can be difficult to understand whether or not you're doing the right thing. And in that way, it's kind of like a, you know, like a small microcosm of just living your life, right?
Yeah, exactly. You are right. It's exactly what you just said. You know, they will do their way anyway.
Let's switch to questions. So Jennifer W., you raised your hand quite a while ago, so I'm not sure if you are still paying attention to the call, but if you are, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And also Chris has raised his or her hand, and I welcome you to also ask your question if you'd like to. All right, if not, I will move on to one of the questions in the comments, which is for the shop towel method, would honey diluted work in place of glycerin? I don't think so. We'll turn to the experts as well, but I believe the reason that glycerin used is because it's that the oxalic acid powder is dissolvable in glycerin. I don't know if it would be in honey. And even if it is, I think you don't want the bees eating the oxalic acid. That's not the method of treatment. You want the oxalic to vaporize slowly over time. So I think that's why honey is not used, but that's just my best guess. Does anybody have any other guesses about why vegetable glycerin?
I have no, I'm not a chemist.
Yeah.
And I leave it up to the experts or to other people that think. Yeah, okay.
I'm sure that Randy Oliver has an explanation for this in his many, many pages and pages of notes and articles on his site. So feel free to look up Randy Oliver, Scientific Beekeeping. I think it's .com. It might be .org. You can Google it. And I'm sure.
Alex?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, don't quote me on this one. I'm with the rest of the guys on it because I'm not a chemist. But I think the problem is that the glycerin is there as a special thickening agent to get it all to, you know, stick nicely in those towels as much as it's used to, you know, make bubbles and stuff like that. It kind of makes a filmy feeling to the liquid it's added in. It's in a lot of like shampoos and stuff for that reason. And so I think if you were trying to substitute honey, but we think of honey as this really, really sticky, gloopy stuff. When it's in the hive at 94 degrees, it flows almost like water, and it's just not going to work, I don't think.
Got it. Okay, another reason why that might not be a good idea as a substitute. Somebody else in the comments said, creates a depot of the oxalic acid for slow release. All right. Let's see. There was another question previously that I wanted to scroll back to. Nope, we asked that one already. Okay, Sally Maynard asks, what is meant by contaminating honey with apivar? Does this only apply to commercial use? Oliver, since you treat with apivar, could you tell us a little bit about considerations about whether or not you can treat with the supers on or not? And like, you know, other considerations around using apivar, because I know you do harvest and sell honey as well, right? We may have lost Oliver. So the Honeybee Health Coalition has a tool which tells you what types of treatment you can use at different times of year, whether or not, and that's basically around whether or not there are a lot of capped cells is what that's a proxy for, as well as whether or not you can treat with the supers on or not. So I believe apivar is only used with the supers off the hive. I'm not sure. If Oliver comes back, we can ask. But the apivar, with all of these treatments to some extent, they will dissolve in different parts of the hive. So that may be a consideration. Elizabeth, I remember you talking about it at some point. One of the treatment types is very similar to an antibiotic, or no, maybe it was an antibiotic specifically for the treatment of other kinds of diseases that it's really dangerous to use when the honey supers are on, right?
Oh, that was another issue with a commercial beekeeper who had been treating with antibiotics for a brood disease and illegally sold on the honey. I always recommend that everybody, if you're going to use a treatment, please look at the label. The label is the law, and it tells you whether or not the treatment is safe for honey. It will say used with the honey supers on or not. The thing you have to remember as a beginner beekeeper, as an amateur, is that, of course, here, especially here in California, as we keep talking about, you've often got honey in your brood box. So don't forget that that honey is there, and treat with a non-honey safe treatment, and then feed that honey to your grandchildren. It's just not safe, just as Oliver was talking about, you know, spraying the ants on the wall right next to where somebody's eating. That's not a safe usage of that treatment. You always want to use it according to the label.
Thank you.
Oxalic is a kind of a funny situation because oxalic is in flowers. It's very high in spinach and, you know, other foods that we eat. And there are plenty of studies out that show the content of oxalic in honey before treatment with vapor and after, and there is no significant difference. And yet it's not allowed to have your honey supers on when you treat.
Yeah, I also had that intuition. I guess one of the things is around the concentration of oxalic, right? And whether or not that oxalic is food safe, right? Like you can make certain chemicals in ways that have certain levels of contamination. And I wonder if that has something to do with why it's not recommended to use with honey supers on.
I just read yesterday that the range after treatment is within the safe health range.
Okay.
If you're using vapor, if you're using 2 grams of vapor, of oxalic per vapor,
okay,
in a double brood chamber, it does not reach the levels to be unsafe with food.
So I think this is everybody should do your own research, right? Like you should make sure to, with the treatment that you're using, read the package. If you're the kind of person who questions the authority of the package, there is other research that you can do. Just make sure that you are, not putting yourself or others at risk when you treat. You should be careful to make sure that you're not doing something that would be dangerous to you or to anybody else who's consuming your honey.
So I'm not advocating anything but what the laws say.
Right. Yeah. And that's true of the guild as well, right? Like we do not advocate the use of oxalic acid vapor because it is not legal in the United States. I think it's an interesting topic just because there are people who do it in California, and I think it's worth knowing about. But we won't advocate for use of any treatment that isn't legal in California. Let's see. Oliver let us know that his Wi-Fi cut out, so unfortunately that's why he's no longer able to answer questions.
I think I'm back now.
Oh, okay, cool. Hi, Oliver. Great. So if anybody has a question for
Oliver.
Oliver.
There was that question, something about Apivar.
Yeah, there was a question around use with honey supers.
Yeah, no, you definitely don't use it with honey supers on.
Okay. And so if you end up with a frame of honey in a brood box that's been treated with Apivar, that doesn't get harvested then?
We treated an apiary in San Mateo with Apivar in September, and then there was a huge eucalyptus flow right away, I think October, November. We got 2 supers that we felt were Apivar contaminated, and we extracted that independently, and I forget what happened to it. but didn't sell it for retail honey.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So people have different levels of, kind of tolerance around whether or not they themselves would consume the honey. Please be careful. Don't do anything stupid, but sometimes that honey can be harvested and then fed back to the bees rather than consumed. So that's just another consideration. Just make sure that you're not harvesting anything that could be contaminated with a non-honey safe treatment, and then selling it, especially, or consuming it. Let's see. Go ahead.
Also, since everything we eat and treated with, apples have been sprayed 16 times average with insecticides. So everything we're eating is so pesticide polluted already. We'd have to be very sloppy with our treatments for the honey to get contaminated.
Thanks, Oliver. So one of the things that Peter mentioned in the comments is there's a temperature component to the risk contamination considerations when, so I think that's true of the treatment as well as like whether or not you would harvest honey that, that was around that treatment. In particular, I know that formic, I'm guessing this is true of most of the organic acids, maybe all the treatments, there's a temperature range, and you don't want, if the outside temperature is outside of that range, what will end up happening is it will vaporize faster than it should, and that can be dangerous to the bees and to you. So please read the package. It can be tiny text. You can find larger versions online. Or videos online. The Honeybee Health Coalition has videos for each treatment method, which will walk you through what you need to do on YouTube. So that's worth looking into as well.
So Formic Pro is below 50 or above 90?
Huh. But you don't treat below 50 or above 90?
Correct.
Got it.
I suppose below 50, you're not getting the fumigant out of the substrate.
It's interesting, right? Because the bees are keeping the hive at a pretty constant temperature, but I guess, like maybe only within the cluster. So that's not enough to really guarantee that that it will fumigate at the rate that it should. Elizabeth also says, simpler than memorizing safety labels, just read. Also, most labels give recommended hive configurations that affect dosage. Yeah, there was a question that came up around this. I remember in the Google group recently around, oh, should I take out my bottom board? Like I have a removable, a screen bottom board with a removable tray. Should I take the tray out for treatment? And the instructions for your treatment will tell you whether or not to. In that particular case, I think it was formic. And for formic, you want to have a certain entrance size, and then keep your tray in if you have a screen bottom board. But yeah, all of that information would be in the instructions on the treatment that you buy. Let's see. Okay, there are 3 Q&A questions that I missed. All right. Mark asks, when talking about checking the brood hive for drones and mites, are you suggesting it's time to lift the supers on top and go through the brood chambers? Alla, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, obviously you have to check your brood chamber once in a while, and I do it every 2 weeks. Trying to do 10 days, but don't have enough time, so 2 weeks. Yeah, you have to open brood chamber.
Naomi asked, what about the taste of the honey? I suppose that is with these treatments. I don't think you can rely on the honey being affected in terms of taste, like in terms of being able to determine whether or not a treatment was used. So I would not count on that as a detection method. I don't know if anybody can speak to whether or not any of the treatments do affect the taste of the honey. Any treatment that you can use with honey supers on, like formic, already exists to some percentage within the honey itself. So I don't imagine that it would affect the taste. Any other comments on that?
One time I tested a smell of the foaming board when one beekeeper used it to empty supers from bees. So he put some kind of like a really
Oh, a
probably
fume board.
big amount of this. And yeah, I tested it, but it was right after we harvested. So I don't know if later this smell goes away.
So Alla's not talking about a treatment method. A fume board is used to remove the bees from supers before harvesting. I think we talked about that last week. Time runs together, or not last week, last month. So that is something to consider when using fume boards. Newt mentions in the comments that thymol will affect honey flavor. That makes sense because thymol is thyme oil. So that is something to consider. And I'm sure the package for thymol also tells you that. Cool. Leslie Haas asks, by treating, wouldn't the mites build up a resistance to the treatment and getting a resistance mite to treatments and bee gut health? What's the effect on the gut of the bees? We don't have any biologists tonight. There will be one next week, or sorry, next month. So maybe we can re-ask that question then. Both Konrad and Alla have mentioned, though, using kind of probiotics to some extent. Alla, I don't know if you would consider your compote a probiotic or not, but just would either of you like to speak to this idea of using, trying to improve bee gut health as a means of fighting off Varroa, and then we can talk a little bit about resistance as well, which is a topic that we haven't touched on.
Just one sentence. Oxalic and formic acid has been around for 30 years now to fight Varroa, and the Varroa mite has not become resistant yet.
Yeah, I asked Alina Nino that question about resistance development, and her comment was, how can you become resistant to tissue damage? The way that formic and oxalic work is they burn the mites, both their foot pads as well as their mouth parts, and it makes them infertile and unable to reproduce, so they fall off and die. They can't eat and they can't reproduce.
I had also heard that as well, that for formic and oxalic, no resistance has been detected. For some of the synthetic chemicals like Apivar, Oliver, I was wondering if you talk about like rotation of treatments, right? Because eventually, if you're treating all of your hives with Apivar, it's recommended that you switch to something else, right?
Yeah, the bees became resistant to Apistan very quickly when we started using it 25 years ago. They're still selling it. And there is fear that overuse of Amitraz, which is Apivar, they're also building resistance. I think a lot of the commercial beekeepers spray the Amitraz on almost every time they work the bees in an unlicensed manner, and that's what is probably causing the resistance to Amitraz, which is the overuse in an undescribed manner. And they probably will become resistant to it. And that's why you only leave the Apivar in for 6 weeks, so that you don't have multiple generations of mites living through it. But they might become resistant to Apivar also, particularly with overuse.
Great, thank you, Oliver. I think we're pretty much out of time. It's already almost 8:30. So I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for volunteering to speak with the membership tonight. This meeting is recorded, so everybody can go back and review anything that you missed. I'll post that as soon as I can get it uploaded. And just a plug for next month's speaker. It will be Samuel Ramsey. This is, we've had two kind of like headliner speakers this year. The first was Michael Bush in March. And Samuel Ramsey is also hopefully going to be really interesting he discovered that Varroa mites feed on the bee fat bodies instead of the hemolymph or the bee blood, which was believed for a long time. And he's doing a lot of research as well on other types of mites and all kinds of things. So we've asked him to talk as well about Varroa mites. I think it'll be a completely different talk rather than around treatment. It'll be more around their biology. So I think that'll be really interesting for everybody. All right. Any last words from any of the panelists? Otherwise, thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight and talking.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.